do sometimes wonder if that helped my street cred a little bit, having been inside of a fairly cozy mid-sized private European pharma company that doesn't shout entrepreneur. But being unemployed for a year and having a setback like that and getting right back up and dusting yourself off does.
In this video, I talked to Geoff Harris, co-founder and CEO of Ocelot Bio. Geoff left his comfortable job at a mid-sized pharma company to start a startup. After about 6 months of fundraising, he was inches away from closing a Series A round, but the deal fell through at the last minute. Nonetheless, he picked himself up, kept going, and ended up raising a bigger round at a better valuation from blue-chip biotech VCs. In this video, Geoff talks about the importance of grit and EQ in starting a company, the lessons he learned from raising his Series A round, and how he developed conviction in the asset and ultimately the confidence to take the leap of faith and start a company. Hope you enjoy. Today, we're talking to Geoff Harris with Ocelot Bio, the CEO and founder of Ocelot Bio. So Geoff, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Hey, thanks, Richard, for having me.
Absolutely. And to start off, can we just hear a little bit about you and what Ocelot does?
Sure. My background, I'm a veterinarian. I have a PhD in immunology. I worked in the pharma industry for about 20 years now. And Ocelot Bio is a spin out from a medium-sized private European pharma company. And we took an asset out of that company and formed a new co and raised money around it, and then are now taking it into the product into phase 2 trials.
Okay, very exciting. So you were at an established company, and you presumably had to make this decision about what to do with this asset. And I know that if you have a stable career and doing well at a company, that it can be hard to take that leap. But can you talk a little bit about what drove you to that decision point and what gave you the confidence to jump out and move forward on your own with this asset?
Sure. The confidence to jump out was, that was a leap of faith. But really, the sort of origin story of it is it's a molecule that I knew exceptionally well. And for any organization to be successful at developing anything, it has to have a complete commitment to it. And this molecule was one where that commitment ended, and the company decided to refocus its portfolio on other areas. And it was one of those things where I could understand from a company standpoint why this was a great decision for the company, but it was a terrible decision for that asset. I mean, for it to die an ignoble death in a freezer, I felt was like a travesty. And really the origin story of the company was that I kind of had that moment where I was really upset and sort of frustrated. I understood why the company made the decision, but I had the realization that somebody should do something, and that there wasn't another somebody to look around and find to do something. It was me. I knew the molecule, I knew the CEO, I was in a position to be able to take it out. And that was really the inspiration for doing this. And I think that's not an uncommon situation, that molecules get discontinued all the time for reasons that are different from, being great assets, let's put it that way. And, you can either be a bystander and say that's too bad, or do something about it. In this case, I don't know, for whatever reason, it was enough for me to let me do something about it and reevaluate my career and, take this path.
And was this something where had there been other opportunities in your career where there were assets that, were shelved for not ideal reasons, where you could have spun something out? Or is this the first time that you really had an opportunity where there's an asset you had a ton of conviction behind, but the company didn't quite have that same level?
I'd say this was the first time where I saw it and was in the position to do something about it, and also to have the degree of conviction that, I've seen other ones where you're like, maybe that wasn't the right decision or the wrong decision to discontinue it, but it didn't have the same effect on me. This one kind of deeply affected me, that I felt like this was really wrong and I had to do something about it.
So you must have had, obviously, to start your own company around this, you must have had a ton of conviction in this asset. Without getting into too much detail, can you share a little bit about what makes you excited about this asset? And then maybe a little bit about your overall, the way that you view assets and how you evaluate a good or a bad asset from your perspective, from the big company side, as well as from the founder side.
Yeah, sure. So in this particular case, we're treating the renal complications that come along with end-stage liver disease. And in fact, a lot of times people actually die of renal complications rather than their underlying liver disease. And the drugs that are available to use that have incredibly they're incredibly difficult to use. They have a lot of safety considerations. And we figured out an incredibly innovative molecular approach to solve that problem, the central problem of non-selectivity of the molecule and exaggerated pharmacology. And we solved both of those in one molecule. And the molecule was so robust in that differentiation that it was clear that it would make existing molecules obsolete if we could get it into the clinic. And that was really part of it, was this recognition that this really fundamentally works. It is completely differentiated in a way that will change the trajectory of patients' lives, and potentially be used far more broadly than existing agents. So that was really part of it, was this unassailable differentiation, and that translating into really meaningful differences for patients. And I'd say that kind of goes into the second part of your question is, when I did business development for larger pharma, that was really a big component of it, is the world really cares if you can, fix a problem that's never been fixed before. It might be difficult to do, but those are the types of things where if you succeed, the world will take notice and you'll get paid for it. And I think this fell in that category for me, is if we can get this through the clinic and demonstrate that differentiation, the rest of the world will line up to be able to market this product, get high utilization. It's not an uphill battle to get utilization of a drug like this.
Right. You said you're solving problems basically, and that is the value you create. You solve a problem that creates value, and then once you demonstrate that to the rest of the world, that'll come back to you in the form of helping your company be more successful. And it sounds like you guys are solving two pretty big problems. So the one is the clinical side. So this is a huge unmet need for patients. Can you talk a little bit more about the standard of care for these patients and the prognosis and what happens to them in absence of an innovative drug like yours?
Sure. So the indication that we're actually going after initially is called hepatorenal syndrome. These patients essentially go into reversible renal failure. If you don't reverse that renal failure, they have sort of a 70 to 80% mortality within 30 days. So, an incredibly dire, life trajectory at that point. And if you can reverse that renal failure, you can essentially pull these patients back. If they had an initiating event like an infection or something that kind of pushed them over into crisis, and you resolve that infection and get them out of renal failure, they can get back out of the hospital and do fairly fine with stable end-stage liver disease. Or you can bridge these patients to transplant. So that's really the value proposition of this particular asset initially, is to get people out of crisis mode and potentially either bridge them to transplant or get them back to stability. Longer term, there's other uses for the drug, around in that same patient population, basically managing their renal function and improving their renal hemodynamics and allowing them to, not need paracentesis for treating ascites and things like that. So there's a lot of utility to, and a lot of potential ability to improve patient outcomes beyond just hepatorenal syndrome.
So you're going after the acute indication first and then potentially expanding into more chronic use. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so it sounds like this is a terrible disease. So 70, 80% mortality. It's on the list of things that, liver disease is something that, it's a really awful way to die, honestly. And these patients are really sick, very low quality of life. And yet there's curative treatments in the form of liver transplant. And so this aspect of renal failure oftentimes is what deprioritizes people and prevents them from actually bridging to a liver transplant. So you can think of it that way, is you have people that could successfully be bridged to a transplant, but don't get there because you can't find a liver in that sort of short time period. This creates that window to do so. And for some number of these patients that have, say, an alcohol abuse disorder or something like that, they've started to address that. You're giving them also potentially the ability to grow back enough residual hepatic mass. They might not even need a liver transplant, but you need to get them through a period of, say, 6 to 12 months before they can kind of get back to that sort of stable place. And so it has the potential to have really tremendous impact of getting people through this bottleneck of, either needing a transplant or at least growing back enough liver so that they don't need one. And you can imagine the same for somebody who's been on
Hep C drugs, where we have very effective Hep C drugs, but if that's realized very late in sort of disease course, you don't have much liver to work with at that point. You need to grow back some to get out of being a high risk for something like this.
Yeah, so you're basically keeping the hope alive for these patients, because there's great treatments out there. It's just not everybody can access a liver transplant. And then some patients just need time to heal. And while they're in this transition phase, they're at risk of suffering these very severe episodes. And right now, there's really nothing for that. And so
Exactly.
that's the first problem you're solving clinically, is you're helping these people recover from these really severe episodes, give them time to heal or get their transplant, and then they can actually access that curative therapy that exists right now but isn't available to everyone.
Yes, and certainly from what people try and do today is use off-label drugs that are, I mean, if you squint really hard, maybe they're better than placebo, is essentially what people have. So, it's essentially supportive care and trying to get people out of crisis with a pretty poor prognosis and quite poor efficacy today. Outside of the U.S., this comes back to the basis for this drug and the molecular mechanism is outside of the U.S. There's a different drug that's utilized, but as I alluded to before, it has some really, really severe safety consequences just from exaggerated pharmacology, that it's very difficult to get the sort of ideal concentration, in all patients that's both safe and efficacious. And so you're either losing safety or efficacy depending upon where you sort of are on its concentration response curve. And it's such a steep dose response curve that it's really difficult to kind of get that that sweet spot. Our drug basically solves that, which is now you have a drug that's actually over a very, very broad dose range, has very little change in its biological activity. So it's now very, very safe and efficacious.
So you saw from the experience with this other drug that has the very sort of sounds like a narrow therapeutic window, that it actually works. When it works, it works.
Yes.
But you really have to thread a needle. And if you don't thread that correctly, then it can be very, have safety consequences and be tough for these patients. So you knew or had a lot of conviction that the underlying mechanism here could be effective, but you really just needed to expand the therapeutic window. So that's,
I think you're putting your finger on exactly what my conviction was there's a tiny needle that exists, needle-like window today with existing therapies. And we created something that's wide enough to drive a truck through with this molecular mechanism, that it's got an incredible window in which it can be utilized. But the mechanism is relevant and works in those patients. So the risk, this comes back to why it was attractive for me personally and the company to initially invest in, is the mechanism's relevant in these patients. And it's a question of the existing drugs just are so difficult to use that they're underutilized and ineffective and have safety problems. And if you could solve that, now you dramatically increase the patient population that you'd be going after, and both your safety and efficacy, both of those will get better.
So that sounds like a very clear problem statement. You have these patients who are in a very bad situation, and something that if you could invent this hypothetical drug, you could solve this problem. You could make these patients better. You could give them a chance to get a transplant or get some of these drugs. So you obviously had some evidence that showed you could solve that problem. So how far along with the asset roughly when you made the decision to spin it out?
So this particular asset had gone into three separate phase 1 studies. So it had gone into, basically to get back, a little bit into this idea of the secret sauce of the molecule is that it functionally behaves like a partial agonist. And so we demonstrated in non-clinical studies, in multiple animal models, in healthy volunteers, that this was extremely robust in terms of the degree of vasoconstriction it caused. That's the primary mechanism. And across all of these different, all these different sort of models and species and in humans, 2 different phase 1 studies, and then a small cohort of patients. So that once it had that data set, that it was unassailably clear that this was, this molecular trick that we had made was incredibly robust. That was, where the company just decided it didn't have the expertise to take it forward into the indication in itself, and it wasn't prepared to invest in that. And that's a very solvable problem. If you have a great molecule with great data, to go out and build a team that could actually take that forward. And that's what we've done.
Okay. Well, yeah, I can start to see where you got your conviction from. So this is something where the unmet need is super clear, the mechanism is clear, and you have phase 1 data that de-risks the main issue. I mean, you have the pharmacology data in humans from multiple.
It's not a leap
phase 1
of faith
studies
anymore. It's right there
Yes.
in front of you that it exists.
Yeah, but it was a leap of faith, as you mentioned earlier, to actually start the company.
The leap of faith of jumping out of a comfy pharma type of job, that's the leap of faith. It wasn't around the molecule, it was around that idea of what it takes to start a company and to get funding. And that was the leap of faith, was I'm sure we could figure that out.
So when you made the decision to start a company, had you ever considered it before? Or did you have an idea in your head of what it would take to start a company, or what that process might be, or who you'd talk to, or what you do? Where were you at in terms of familiarity with the process of starting a company?
So I can tell the audience very much, I had never thought about being a CEO of a company ever in my life up until this moment. And that's not to be said that I hadn't thought about what it would be like to be part of starting a company and be in small pharma and get out of being in a larger pharma company. I just hadn't imagined being the initial founder of doing something like that. But really it came down to, in a sense, talking with people in my network that had started companies. I have a very good friend, Scott Struthers at Crinetics, who I saw when he left Neurocrine, and it was 3 people, literally in a garage with, used equipment that they cobbled together and surviving off of grants, going all the way to a public, very successful public company. It really helped to have somebody like that to be like, come on, this isn't that hard, you can do it.
Yeah.
To convince me to say, okay, well, I don't have any idea what I'm doing, but I could sure, how hard can it be, in a sense? I'm sure it's clearly people have solved this. It doesn't take, I'd say it takes effort more than it takes genius. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. And you definitely displayed the importance of effort when you got the company started and funded. Can you talk a little bit about the story of your fund process?
Sure. So I'd say initially, we actually had some good traction as we were trying to get the agreements in place to move the asset out of the company, and some initial interest from venture groups, where we had chatted with them of, hey, that sounds really interesting. Come back to us when you have a more clear ownership and exactly how this will work and the mechanics of it. We'd like to talk with you. And that was in the end of 2019 and very early 2020. And we actually signed the deal with Ferring Pharmaceuticals, the company that the molecule came from, on March 13th of 2020, which was a wonderful Friday the 13th. The weekend before the pandemic really shut down everything in America. So that was maybe not the most auspicious moment to start a fundraising process, where everybody was sort of panicked with their own portfolio companies and trying to figure things out. After some initial sort of traction, we actually, I actually had a lot of interest kind of into the, a couple months after the sort of very beginning of the pandemic. And then thought we were pretty close to having a deal to be signed and moving forward with developing a syndicate. And that fell apart kind of at the very, very, very last minute. And so what I'd say, at least what I learned out of that experience is, we went back and said, okay, how can we improve our product, in terms of the team, decrease risk, improve on telling the story, and ultimately, having that sort of grit and perseverance. Certainly we had our moment of disappointment, but that actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise, that we ultimately landed with, a syndicate of 3 fantastic backers that, filled out a very sizable Series A and have, are fully prepared to take the company through Series B and into the public markets eventually. So I think we ultimately ended up in a better spot than we would have to begin with. But it wasn't, I'd say it wasn't the perfect process, let's put it that way. And certainly we could, if I'd learned anything out of that, of a slightly more rapid process probably would have worked a bit better.
A more rapid process would have worked a bit better. So you said, I guess to look at the timeline a little bit, you were working on this originally late 20 and then early 2020, pandemic hit, and then you were getting things together a couple months after the pandemic. So this is maybe 5 or 6 months from kind of your initial testing the water conversations to really getting close to getting something done.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's, maybe that was right or wrong. It was what happened is that we were pretty confident that that deal was going to close and kind of shut down further discussions with other people. Went into an exclusivity period, and then that kind of bit us when that deal fell through.
Yeah, that's brutal. And there's not a ton of blue chip biotech Series A VCs out there, so I can only imagine how much tough that must have been to get there with a group of them and then have to start from scratch.
Yes, well, it increased my N of experience of fundraising. So I have an N of 2 now rather than 1, but only one company. Is being able to really structure your thoughts around who are your highest probability, backers, and be able to kind of get that in order very quickly, arrange and get outreach going to those in a parallel process rather than a serial process. It certainly makes it difficult if you're trying to, move the whole herd, so to speak, at the same time. And certainly if somebody expresses interest, but you're looking to fill out a syndicate or things like that, that certainly, it made it a bit more difficult to, have that be more serial than parallel.
So you have people who have a little bit of interest, but they're not fully committed to give you a term sheet tomorrow. Having a number of other warm leads who are pretty close to getting something makes it much easier to pull that round together.
Yeah. Certainly. I mean, anybody in sales will tell you that the, now is like, get on the bus or don't, and that somebody else will take your place is a powerful driver for decision making. And certainly if you're giving people, well, we'll get back to you tomorrow, and you only have one or two people that you're talking to, it just doesn't create that sense of urgency to make a decision. And I'd say, if I learn anything out of that, trying to create the urgency amongst the potential backers of, not wanting to be left out and being diligent and being on top of, moving their own internal process forward, I think would have made for probably a more rapid process for us.
Yep, that makes sense. So that was one of your learnings, is to have a process where you're getting everybody moving at the same time in parallel, rather than just kind of one-off conversations here and there. Any other things that you learned the first go round that you helped you the second time?
I mean, I think the other part, I'd say this comes from the standpoint of having been inside a larger pharma company where you had a lot of technical expertise and pitching to an internal executive team. The level of detail and sort of amount of thinking and showing what's behind that thinking was probably a little bit overwhelming initially to VC groups. So I think we started out, and this will potentially resonate with any number of people, of essentially the don't trust me, let me show you my work, so to speak. We probably overwhelmed some of our initial potential venture backers by just providing too much information rather than keeping it short and sweet, and then saying, hey, look, more going into a model of trust but verify, so that people are going to trust that you're telling them what's true, and that you go into a verification process later rather than taking somebody through that in real time in a pitch meeting. Yeah,
definitely makes sense. And I also tend to get into the details and everything a little bit too early sometimes, and it doesn't always work as well when
it doesn't work in your favor, honestly, when somebody's like starting to look at their at their phone and trying to figure out like if they could get out of this meeting because this is too much detail.
Yeah, for sure. So that's something you picked up on during your initial meetings. You could tell that maybe this isn't landing the way that I wanted to, and then you just, I'm sure you have tons of experience in your beauty and pharma career to realize changing the pitch for your audience. So that was that was pretty easy for you to do, I assume, once you picked up on it.
If I look back at some of the aesthetics and amount of detail in some of our initial presentations, I do look back at it and think, what were we thinking? So, but I think that adaptation and, maybe this is actually something that's really important to try and figure out how to do. Is on the one hand, you want to have conviction and your own belief of what's right and how to do things. But you also have to take in feedback and not trying to keep repeating the same experiment over and over and not getting the result you want. And I think that was something that we were pretty good at over time. Probably could have gotten there a bit faster, but being able to look and say, hey, the aesthetics of these slides, they're not good. Our message is getting lost. It's too much information. What could we do to kind of clip, simplify, get it down to its essentials. And then if somebody's interested, then they'll dig deeper. It probably took us longer to get there than I would have liked. But ultimately that's what we did, rather than, just trying to beat the same drum over and over and over again, and, not getting the results that we wanted.
And did you send your deck around to your friends in the industry or people who are familiar with the VC world for feedback, or did you just pretty quickly clue in on what was going on and just know what you needed to do?
Yeah, I think it was a combo of both. I think that's getting feedback from some of our friends. I think in fact, some of our friends could have been probably a bit more effective in their feedback of being like, this is too much.
Yeah.
But I think part of that too was just in terms of the questions that we got from people. What we started to see, were the things where they had questions that we thought were pretty clear, and they would come back with questions. So I think we pretty rapidly figured out sort of the universe of things that where we were telling the story well and where we weren't, and adjusting accordingly.
Yep, that makes sense. And then in terms of finding the investors, I know you have a pretty good network, but did most of your introductions to investors come from within your network, or did you have to do proactive outreach to track down connections to people? Can you talk a little bit more about that process?
Sure. I think it was a combo of both, because I'd been in the San Diego region, so I had pretty good reach in the San Diego community, but that's a much smaller venture community. And then some in the Boston area, just because I was doing business development, and less in the Bay Area than probably would have been helpful. And that was maybe one thing that was pretty interesting is I think maybe this is less now than it was, 18 months ago. But I think there is a little bit that bias of people, from California wanting to invest in companies that are in California, and companies in Boston being a little bit more biased towards, wanting people within walking distance of Kendall Square. So some of those network connections in the Boston area weren't quite as fruitful as I would have hoped. And the San Diego community was fairly small. So it did take some work and, combo of leveraging my network, not being shy to ask for introductions from people that were in my network, or, trying to, like one of the events that you ran, I actually met a couple of people that I hadn't met previously. And so, being kind of pragmatic in how do you meet and run into people and chat with them, try and develop an initial connection and then leverage that.
Awesome. Yeah, and it sounds like you did the work, obviously, and got it done. And, all the things you talk about how you did things, not ideally, but you still, almost got that round done. And obviously that's a testament to the quality of the asset and the quality of you as well, and the quality of your team. So how big was your team when you were doing this first fundraise?
So this goes back to my sense from the venture community is, in a sense, there's the asset obviously is one risk. But by far and away, the biggest bet that they're taking is on you and your team and your ability to build a team as an entrepreneur. And initially our team was me and my co-founder, neither of which have been chief medical officers or had a lot of depth in mid to late stage development. And so while we could compellingly tell the story of the molecule and sort of conceptually how to develop it, the real specifics of who would be responsible for that was TBD in terms of, as a founding team. And I think that, to be fair, I think that worked against us in terms of where people are like, it had some risk. Can we find the right team to actually build this and do this? It was a trust us, we'll be able to do that. After the deal fell through, going back to this idea of how do we improve our product, it was part of our product is our team. And we went out and recruited a chief medical officer who essentially became a quasi late founder to the company before we had raised money, and helped us work through a much more clear development program. And I think that paid big dividends when we were then going around and talking with people, because it made it much less of a leap of how is this team going to move forward and build. It was sort of it added a third leg to our stool that was, here's somebody with a compelling vision, somebody who can help build the team and do the CMC side. This brought in somebody with the development experience and sort of gravitas to take on that element of it authoritatively. And I think that really helped us out a lot.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so you had this experience of the deal falling through, and then you made the product, which is referring to what you offer as an investment, better. And you brought on some great team members and filled in that gap of that. The risk is, can you build a team? And it sounds like that was the same risk you identified. You had a ton of confidence in the asset. You obviously had enough confidence in yourself to start the company, but then bringing the right people around you is something you said you hadn't done before. So
yeah, I mean, and that was something I was very honest with the venture capitalists, is that recognition that and in a sense, whether it was an effective sort of cynical trick or not, I have no idea. But that aspect of pointing out that I know that I'm one of the biggest risks, and being able to be very honest with them that I understand that, rather than being sort of having a big degree of hubris, having that humility to recognize that they're making a big bet on me as the CEO, as somebody who can tell a story, who can hire a great team, manage that team to, go forward and build a group of people that have the passion to drive this forward and be successful. That was the leap of faith on their part, is that belief that I could do that. And, I think that, in some ways played to my advantage to be honest with them that I recognize that risk.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the, larger biotech VCs do tend to be, fairly skeptical, because, they see what happens to drugs in the clinic and all these other things, and they can go wrong in biotech. And I know a few of them have said that one of the biggest turnoffs is when people are overly, have a little too much hubris, I guess. And being because that's a foreshadowing of what's going to be like in the board meetings.
Yes.
If you get something that comes up surprisingly, they want somebody who's going to tell it to them straight and fix it, not somebody who's going to, kick the can down the road.
Yep. I mean, I'd say, just from the leap of doing this, you have to have enough hubris to actually think that you can do it. But you also have to have enough humility and be grounded in reality that I think you're a compelling partner in, creating a company and moving it forward. I mean, ultimately, that's what the venture backers are looking for, is a partnership to build a company. And they want to build that partnership with somebody that's, that they first like and enjoy and is grounded in reality.
Yeah, so that's a good segue into maybe the last and potentially most interesting topic we can talk about, when you mentioned having that combination of the hubris and confidence, and then being attached to reality, knowing when you need to change, and then the grit to just push through when things get hard. So we sort of just glossed over the fact that you had a big fundraising deal fall through. That must not have been easy to deal with. And I know a lot of people at that stage would just say, well, I said I was going to try this. I tried it, didn't work. Let's pick up the phone and see if I can get my old job back. So what went through your head when you heard that news? How did you process that? How did you respond?
I don't know if you, as a kid, if you ever had one of those like punching bags that you punch down and it flops down and then flops back up. Yeah. For whatever reason, I'm kind of like, that's kind of my personality. So, I mean, it was one of those things that was disappointing. But at the same time, it was like, well, things happen. What are you going to do? Dust yourself off. You have conviction that is my conviction changed? No. So it's a question of what can we do to address, I'd say the thing that we most didn't want to do is go immediately back and start talking with people saying, hey, this deal fell through. We looked at it and said, okay, what would make this a more compelling opportunity? And let's, in a sense, take this off the market for a short period of time and think about what's been holding us back, what would improve this, and let's go address those. Let's go do that, and then go back out and with a better story and team and vision of what we want to accomplish. And that's ultimately what served us well. So I don't think it was a setback along the way in some ways, but it helped ultimately improve the focus of the company, the message of what we wanted to do. It actually did expand the scope of what we wanted to do as a company, actually, that we, instead raised more money after that. So in a way, it did us a service. It just didn't feel good at the time to get punched in the face like that.
Yeah, that's an amazing response. It sounds like you were, set back, but completely undaunted. And I think we talked or something like pretty shortly after the deal fell through, and you were, I don't know, maybe a day or so, I don't even know what the timing was, but you basically were already over it and planning out the next step, which was, I mean, that's a very, very impressive thing to see.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps the other crashes that I've had in my life, skiing and doing other things, you get up and dust yourself off and make sure everything's still attached, served me well in this case as well.
Yeah, and you had a co-founder at that point, right? But you didn't have the other folks on the team.
We did not have the CMO hadn't joined the team yet. So that was, I mean, within days, that's what we were working on, is trying to, recruit somebody else to the team to our newly failed deal.
Yeah. So you guys were completely on the same page about what you wanted to do. You knew what the challenges ahead were. And then you outlined these, you used it's not as an opportunity to just like crawl back to where you were, but you took the chance to say, look, here's what we did. We got pretty far. We made progress. Here's how we can improve. And then you actually got a better outcome than you would have originally.
Absolutely. Raise more money at a higher valuation with a more clear focus of what we want to do with an upgraded group of, an upgraded syndicate. I mean, everything got better.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I think that's, exactly what investors probably love to see, is something like that happens and you just don't back down. You keep moving forward and keep improving. I
mean, I do sometimes wonder if that helped my street cred a little bit, having been inside of a fairly cozy, mid-size private European pharma company. That doesn't shout entrepreneur. But being unemployed for a year and having a setback like that and getting right back up and dusting yourself off does.
Yeah.
So I think that might have, in the end, also increased my street cred of being somebody who was gritty enough to make things happen and be, and to really have that conviction.
Yeah. And you weren't, a lot of other entrepreneurs, sometimes, you work within a venture fund to start a company, and you were not like that. Just to be clear, you were completely independent. You had your job at your big pharma company, you left and you started it. And this was something that you were doing. You weren't, working as an entrepreneur in residence or a venture partner. This was just you and your co-founder going alone.
This was me convincing my partner that I was going to take, a year's worth of, living expenses and set them aside and be like, she and I are going to go through a year of living expenses and we'll see where we get to.
Yeah. And then I'm sure inevitably
fully self-backed.
Yeah. The year of living expenses, as always happens with things, probably ends up being a little bit longer than that in the grand scheme of things. But eventually pushing through and making it happen. And yeah, I mean, everything that you've described, it just sounds like an incredibly compelling team. And I'm not just saying this to plug anything. But I mean, the asset sounds super compelling. I mean, you're obviously very compelling as well. You've built a great team, and I would imagine there might be some people who'd be interested in seeing if they could work with you after this. Are you guys hiring or looking for, new people now or in the future, or where can people go to learn more about you and what you're working on?
Sure. So right now they can go to ocelotbio.com. Right now they will see a very stealth website that was designed very purposely to be fairly stealthy. The company is kind of emerging from its stealth mode here and starting to actually build the team. So we're now, I think as of this week, we're 9 people and on our way up to probably 12 or 13 in the sort of near term, building out our clinical operations team, finance team, actively recruiting. If you're looking at this on YouTube a year from now, those positions are probably filled. And then looking to, probably within the next 18 months, build the team up to something on the order of 15 to 20 people as we complete the phase 2 study, and then started working on additional indications and taking it into phase 3. So I think this is one thing that is a little bit of a challenge, maybe that's a little bit different than, say, a discovery team that's working on things, is the trajectory of going from a tiny group of people to the team necessary to develop a phase 2 molecule, to take it into phase 3 and commercialize it. It's a very rapid build that the company needs to go on. So we're trying to build out the company in that regard right now.
Yeah, moving into phase 2 and phase 3, that's serious for sure. And hopefully in a year from now, you'll have made a good amount of progress on that. So for you personally, what's the biggest thing what's your biggest goal right now? What's your biggest, are you just looking to build out the team, looking to get the study design locked? Is there anything in particular that you're focused on right now?
Yeah, so I'd say there's two things. So one is just the mechanics of going and executing this study and making sure that we execute it correctly. This is, it's an operations play, that making sure that we get into the right patients that have a low probability of response to placebo, high probability of response to drug. It's finding the right window of treatment and getting them described accurately in the inclusion-exclusion criteria, and going and really optimizing and understanding the dosing of these patients, sort of optimal duration, dose, getting that nailed down and executing that study. Because, essentially, if you get to the other side of this and you have that information, your probability of having a product is, as high as it ever gets in this crazy business of the pharma, in pharma development, is you almost assuredly have a product in hand at that point. So the team is hyper focused on getting that study set up and executed correctly. That's, to me, the most important thing that the company has to do. The other part, though, and I think, in talking with people that have started companies and things like that, the other part that's really critical is building your culture, because you can always imagine that just let's get it done, get things going, be pragmatic. Company culture is the differentiator for a company. Science doesn't do itself, people do. And a group of people that believe in the mission, are excited about their part in that mission, and are excited and are good team members and good colleagues. That's something where you wake up every day and you're excited about what you're doing and who you're doing, what your mission is, what your role is, and who you're doing it with. That's a very sticky position to be in. Why would you take a different job? You're getting paid well, you care about it, you like the people. And I'm trying really hard to focus on that aspect of it as well, is to build a sustainable culture where we're all in this together. And we have it's much, in that sense, it's much easier in a smaller company than a big pharma company. You have one North Star that there's no argument over what the North Star is. It's right there. It's a question of how to do it and how to create the culture where people feel heard, listened to, have that collegiality, but also recognize that at some point we'll have to make potentially imperfect decisions with imperfect information, and get behind those decisions and go execute. And finding people that are believe that aspect of, that's how to be successful as a company, is to ultimately be high EQ, high respect for one another, and, prioritize those personal relationships as a key part of building the company.
Yeah, and I can definitely tell that you manifest all of those values yourself. So I'm sure you have to be very intentional about the culture, but obviously the fact that those values seem to be the ones that you personally have, I'm sure makes it a lot easier to do that and attract people who share that. And the mission as well. It sounds super compelling. You described the unmet need that these patients face and what you could potentially offer them if that works. And that seems exceptionally motivating. So it doesn't seem like you have any issues on that front.
Well, it goes back to this idea of building a team is different than having a vision for the team. And that's then you're now faced with reality. So that's my goal, is to try and, hopefully help self-select people that are really talented. But more importantly, one of my favorite quotes is, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. And I really believe that I want to create a group of people that aren't looking around, and that's not their first instinct, is to think who's the smartest person in the room, is how are we all together more than the sum of our parts. And that as a team, we can accomplish great things. And they're yes, I've been looking for that all my life, or I've experienced that, and it was fantastic. Looking for people that is almost the most important thing to them, is that they recognize that that's how to be successful, is to work with other people that are like-minded like that reach a hand out and pull one another up. We all make one another better, to be the reason to join a team.
Yeah, that's awesome. It seems like you're you're built for this. It seems like you really like this is you love doing it. So that's really really awesome to hear. And I soon, but thank you so much for taking the time to talk. It was, I mean, I've heard a little bit of this, but it was really great to hear in more detail on what you went through and what you guys are working on. Super inspiring, and really appreciate you taking the time to talk today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Richard. And certainly to anybody that's watching this, it's not an easy journey, but it's not an impossible one either. So don't be put off by the fact that it's not easy. Things that are really worth doing in life are frequently not easy, but it's entirely worthwhile.
Awesome. Well, that's a great note to end on. So thanks again, Geoff. It was great talking to you. And yeah, best of luck with everything.
Hey, thank you so much, Richard.
Awesome.